you know, you've got these sites, Harappa, and further, if you go along the river Indus. By the way, below the Indus, you see what's called the Ghaggar Hakra, which is in fact actually a river that dried up. I mean, so the Punjab, incidentally, means the land of 5 rivers. Panj is 5, all right, but it used to be 7 rivers over there, and so you have the Ghaggar, and then you have a river called the Saraswati, which are 2 rivers that are supposed to have dried up. And you'll see to the left, to the west over there, Mohenjo-daro, and then in its proximity, you see a number of other important sites as well. All right, just to give you a basic layout, and you notice it says Thar Desert sites. How many sites are we talking about? Basically, roughly about 1,000, something on the order of about 1,000 sites. But 2 really major cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and then if you go further south, you'll see a place called Dholavira, and then there's a place which you don't see on this map. It's called Lothal, which is in Gujarat. Right, and in fact, they've done extensive excavations over there. They're supposed to be in a dry dock over there, according to some archaeologists. And as you'll find out in a couple of minutes, there were extensive trading links between the Indus Valley people, right, and Mesopotamia, or modern-day Iraq. Right? So just a few different maps to give you a sense of what we're talking about, and you can see that these sites are either along the rivers, right, or in close proximity to water. That's the critical thing, but the general area is dry and arid. And we know, I think, quite reliably, can't be absolutely certain, in fact, can't be absolutely certain about almost anything probably with having to do with the Indus Valley Civilization, because what you really have is you have these archaeological deposits. But I think it's reasonably certain that all of these sites were, as I said, you know, very close to a body of water, you know, either on a river or otherwise close to a body of water. All right, and that's something that you need to keep in mind when you look at this area, and reasonably certain that there was no canal irrigation, even though the Indus Valley people, in fact, actually did domesticate a number of crops: wheat, barley, peas, among others. All right. So here's another map now, and here you can see, you know, the clusters a little bit more if you look at the red dots over there, and then again Harappa, you know, further north and east, and then to the southwest of that, further down along the river Indus, you see Mohenjo-daro, and on this map you can actually see Lothal. So if you go further down, all the way to the last sites, you'll see a site marked Lothal, which is in modern-day Gujarat. They've done actually quite a lot of excavation in Lothal in recent years. And now here you've got a very simplified map which simply shows you like 3 or 4 of the major sites, just so you have a sense of their relationship to each other. The area that we're talking about, where these sites are to be found, is roughly about 1,000 miles, north to south. Okay? And one interesting question is why the civilization did not develop further east along the Gangetic Plain, right, in what I had called the heartland of India. That's an interesting question, right? And that may have to do with the nature of the civilization, the fact that it was largely waterborne, if I may put it this way, that if you had moved further inland, you would have had to clear dense jungle, among other things, and so on. Okay? And now you're going to see a few slides of the sites that we're talking about. So this is Mohenjo-daro. You can see the citadel on top. There's a mound over there. Right? This brickwork is original brickwork, right? And so when we're talking about the Indus Valley Civilization, remember what I mentioned to you, that roughly it originates around 3000 BC. By 1750, 1800 BC, it's going to disappear, right? And the reasons for its disappearance are not entirely clear. One, there are 3 or 4 major speculations. I want to enter into that question right now, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the features of the civilization. You know, why did it disappear? Well, it may have disappeared because of flooding. One of the things that the excavations have revealed is that the street level continued to rise over the years. Now, that's very good, a very good sign of the fact there probably was flooding over the years, that over centuries these people became accustomed to that, but then at some point there was some kind of cataclysmic flood which they couldn't deal with. That's one possibility. There's also been argued, and again, it's the archaeological evidence here indicates some degree of burning in some places, that that the city of Mohenjo-daro, for example, might have been burned down to the ground. Now, if it was burned down to the ground, it was probably done by somebody else, and this is, of course, where we are going to eventually start talking about the Aryans in the second half of the lecture today, the coming of the Aryans, right? That there was some encounter between the Indus Valley people and the people that are known as the Aryans, right? The other possibility is that the rivers dried up, or that their course significantly became different, and therefore there was no food supply available to these people, right? That's another theory. Right? So you would need some kind of ecological narrative in order to understand exactly what happened here, and as I said, this is largely based on speculation, especially by people who have actually studied early Indian history. And what you're seeing here is actually a photograph which shows you one of the great buildings here, which is the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in just a few moments, but I just want to go through some of these slides over here. You've got a different idea of what the Great Bath looks like. And when we talk about the Great Bath here, let me give you what its dimensions were, just so that you have an idea. We're talking about 11.88 meters long, right? 7 meters wide, and about 2.5 meters deep, right? This is what's called the Great Bath. And there's an interesting divergence of opinions about what this Great Bath may have represented. A.L. Bhasham, who wrote a book. So A.L. Bhasham is an Australian scholar. He wrote a book which has a title called The Wonder That Was India. You notice the past tense, by the way, right? Was. Why was? And then, of course, you have to see where his history stops. And it essentially stops with the coming of the Muslims, right? So in effect, you can put 2 and 2 together, that once the Muslims come, well, basically the India that we knew is no longer the glorious India that everybody thinks about, right? I mean, in effect, that's the point of view. I'm obviously simplifying it, and I don't want to minimize his work as a scholar, because in fact he had lots of interesting things to say, and is quite a rigorous scholar of Hinduism in particular, right? But this book was a classic for many years. I mean, it was used widely for 30, 40 years, and I just want to tell you what he says about the Great Bath, just so that you have an idea of what is some of the controversy. If you read Nehru's discovery of India, he is quite clear that the Indus Valley was a highly secular civilization. Okay? A highly secular civilization. But if you read Bhasham, and I'm going to quote, you get a very different impression. Like the tank of a Hindu temple. So if you ever go to South India especially, you're not going to find this quite often in North India. You will find it in North India in some places, but you don't really have, for example, in the Gangetic Plains, you don't really have temples that have survived. I mean, most of the temples are relatively recent. Some may go back to 200, 300, 400 years. But if you want to look at the older Hindu temples, you really have to go down into South India. Okay? And if you go to these temples, you'll find usually that there is a tank, a body of water alongside the temple. All right? So this is what he means when he says, like the tank of a Hindu temple, it probably had a religious purpose. Okay? Well, how did he come to this conclusion? Right? He's looking at temples today, and then he's saying, well, this great bath probably had a religious purpose. But remember that this great bath is not attached to a temple. There's no archaeological evidence that there was a temple attached to this particular great bath. And the cells may have been the homes of priests. The special attention paid by the people of the Harappa culture, so the culture as a whole is called Harappan. Even if you're speaking about the city of Mohenjo-daro, it's called Harappan culture, right? The special attention paid by the people of the Harappa culture to cleanliness is hardly due to the fact that their notions of hygiene and advance of those of other civilizations of their time. Well, perhaps it did. How does he know? Right? I mean, you see how he's reaching these conclusions. And this is where you go back to the question of Orientalism. Now, so he doesn't want to suggest that Indians had perhaps a better sense of hygiene. And I'm not saying that they did. But I'm just saying that one has to be an agnostic on this question. One really can't know, right? Okay? But indicates rather that, like the later Hindus, they had a strong belief in the purificatory effects of water from a ritual point of view. Right? So now the probably is not really probably, if you read the second sentence that I've just quoted to you, because what he wants to really argue is that this great bath had a religious purpose. Now this is critical. And it's critical because essentially what he wants to argue is that the fundamental basis of Indian civilization is religion. And this is where again you get into the question of Orientalism, the late 18th century, because one of the things that the colonial writers are going to argue is that what distinguishes India, okay, from other civilizations is the fact that it is an essentially religious civilization in its core, and that core remains constant over a period of several thousand years. Okay? It remains constant over a period of several thousand years. Right? So, and you know, if you think about it, I mean, why is it that in the 1960s, you know, the hippies were all going to India? You know, the land of yogis, great saints, spiritual teachers, right? And half the Hollywood actors today, they have some kind of Indian guru. And this idea that India is preeminently a land of spirituality and religion is an idea of 18th century vintage, fundamentally, right? So here we have the Great Bath, and we have a bit of a, as I said, you know, uncertainty about what exactly this might have been for. I mean, was it a common bath? You know, is it like the Turkish baths that you find, right? That a place that, you know, you would go, which was a public bathing space, most likely, but not according to Bhasham in any case, right? And now what you have here is a figure. So now let me talk a little bit about what is the kind of evidence. So one thing we have is we have obviously the archaeological evidence. We have the excavations that have been done there. The other thing we have is they have found seals. You're going to see a few slides in a moment. These seals are roughly about 2 inches by 2 inches, right? And they're about, you know, a couple of hundred different motifs. These different motifs can be put into several different categories. So you've got animals, you know, you'll have the horned bull, you'll have some cattle, you'll have the elephant, right? Then there are figures, right? And what you also have is a few objects. So you've got pottery, you've got toy carts, and then you have this figure, which is a figure of a dancing girl. She's got bangles going all the way from nearly the top of her shoulder to the middle of her arm, even lower than that, and she's got a necklace. All right? And you have some figurines of this kind. Let me show you some others now. This is supposed to be the head of a man known as the priest king. Okay? And by the way, when you say priest king, you know, this designation was given essentially by colonial writers who I think were thinking of Plato's Republic, where you have somebody called the philosopher king. Okay? And so they took the idea of the philosopher king and they turned him into the priest king. Well, we don't really know whether there was a class of people there called priests, right? And if they were priests, what religion were they presiding over? Because I'm assuming, unless, you know, they're high priests of finance or something like that, which is unlikely at that point in time, right? So what are they priests of? Right? They're priests of some religion, but then you need some idea of what the religion may have been like, and frankly, we don't really know that much. Right? I mean, you can take the figure of a woman and you can say, well, she represents a fertility goddess. Right? And you know that there's this idea that has been floating around in certain kinds of circles that all prehistoric civilizations were fundamentally feminine civilizations because you had the fertility goddess. Right? That feeds into that strand of thought. Right? But what I'm saying is that when we designate this person as a priest king, this designation appears to have been taken from somewhere else. Right? And now you're seeing the sites of Harappa itself. Okay, so before what you saw was Mohenjo-daro, now you see Harappa, and you're seeing the layout roughly of that the excavations has shown. As I said, extensive drainage, and in fact many modern historians, to repeat something that I mentioned in the previous class, have come to the conclusion that the drainage facilities were so good that perhaps modern India might want to emulate these drainage facilities, given what happens in India when you get the monsoon rains these days. Here's a toy cart. All right, this toy cart has been was recovered from a couple of different sites, and roughly would date to around 2000 BC. And now you see the seals. So there's an elephant. Right. Let me say something, by the way, about the script now. Okay. So on top of the elephant, you see all of these writings, markings. There have been over 50 attempts, or 50 claims. The attempts probably run into the hundreds. There have been over 50 claims by scholars saying they have finally deciphered the Indus Valley script. None of these claims is accepted. Okay, we don't really know what this script is. There's some conjectures about what it may have been like, and we've got a few problems in trying to look at the script. It's not phonetic, and it cannot be phonetic partly because you have, where if you said that each symbol represented one letter of the alphabet, the problem is you've got about a couple of hundred symbols. So you can't have a language which has an alphabet of 200 or 300 letters. That's way too big. Okay? If, on the other hand, you said that each of these seals represents one word or one concept, then the problem is their vocabulary would have been a few hundred words, which is also equally absurd. Right? So if you've got, let's say, 300 different kinds of seals, and you say each seal, okay, if one certain image, and you might find that image in 10 different seals, how many seals have they found? A few thousand. Okay? And then, as I said, you could say, okay, so there are 20 of the elephant, 15 of the tiger. I'm giving you just random numbers, hypothetical numbers. And you say that each of these represented one word of the language. Well, if there are 300 different images here, the problem is that this language, then we're saying, would have been confined to 300 words, which is an absurdity. It's not possible. It would have to be much larger than that, right? But it seems that the script would have to be read left to right, right? And as I said, over here, what you're seeing is the elephant, which they had domesticated. They had tamed the elephant. Number of animals that they had tamed and domesticated. You've got sheep, you've got goats, you have cattle, right? You've got the elephant. You're going to see the humped cattle, the water buffalo, and then the tiger. I'm not saying that they domesticated the tiger, but obviously the tiger was in close proximity and they were aware of the tiger, right? And here you have, this is something that represents what you might describe as a humped cattle. It's not quite clear exactly what this animal is, but that's what it seems to be. And here you have a very interesting figure, and there's been a lot of speculation about this. This is described as a Proto-Shiva. You're going to hear more about Shiva much later on. Shiva is going to be one of the major Indian gods of classical Hinduism, and today, he is one of the major gods of the Hindu pantheon, right? So this is supposed to be a representation of the Proto-Shiva. But again, some speculation on this point. We're not quite sure. He's seated in the posture of a yogi. And that's one reason why there's speculation that he's Shiva, because Shiva is very often shown in the posture of a yogi, right? Somebody who is sitting there meditating. And now you have here, again, Shiva surrounded by a number of animals. Yes?
So would this support the argument that Aryans did not bring religion, didn't bring...
No, the idea that this is a Proto-Shiva means that there may be some Hindu gods whose origins go back to the Harappan period. Right? That's why it's called the Proto-Shiva, because there's obviously the iconography of Shiva as it's going to develop later on is going to be a bit different, but elements of that have been certainly borrowed from the Harappan culture. So if you're trying to look at the Hindu gods, right, and very few people here at this point know about the Hindu gods, because we're going to get into that obviously much later on in a week or so. Right? But if you look at, let's say, gods such as Vishnu or Shiva and so on, then the question is, well, what are their origins? In the case of Shiva, it seems that the origins go back to the Harappan civilization, which means that some elements of what becomes known as Hinduism, okay, are in fact elements that go back to the Harappan period. Right? This is what we mean here when we speak about the Proto-Shiva. And here again you have the tiger, the stripes. You can see that through the stripes, right? And this is how, because obviously if you're looking at the horns, it doesn't look like but the stripes seem to indicate that this is in fact actually a tiger. All right? So I just wanted to give you a sense of what some of these seals are like, some of these images are like. And let me say a few more words about the Indus Valley Civilization, and then we're going to move on to the coming of the Aryans. Now, I've already mentioned to you the circumstances under which it disappeared, and as I said, roughly 3000 to 1800 BC, 1700 BCE is when this civilization flourished. The layout of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro is in fact quite similar. So you have a citadel, right, and you have this mound. Both of them had granaries, okay, granaries. Now that's interesting, because that means that there was excess grain that was stored. right? And this grain is produced somewhere else, maybe in the near vicinity. The nature of cities, of course, today has changed quite dramatically, so we don't very often understand what is the relationship between the city and the food supply that it gets. But cities had to be dependent upon the food supply, which was coming from somewhere within close proximity, right? These granaries are too big to be the granaries of wealthy individuals, right? In other words, you know, we can't speculate from this and say that, well, in fact, these were probably the warehouses where extremely wealthy individuals stored their grain, because the size of these granaries is really, in fact, much too big. To give you an idea, the one that existed in Mohenjo-daro, the estimate, according to the excavations, is that this was 45 to 46 meters long and 15 meters wide. All right, now that's a huge size for a granary. Now, alongside the granary, in close proximity to it, you have rows of small tenement houses. Okay, and these small tenement houses suggest that this is where the people who pounded the grain probably lived. Okay, because if you have grain, it has to be pounded, and this is probably where these people lived. But again, you know, this is an educated sort of guess based on the archaeological evidence that has been uncovered up till this point in time. I've already spoken about the town planning. I had mentioned to you that the streets are right angles and the cities seem to be quite nicely laid out, right, according to the archaeological evidence that we have. Pottery was produced, almost mass produced, all right. Considerable fragments of pottery have been found, in some cases full pots, not very many, but considerable evidence of pottery, right? And there seems to have been some amount, perhaps considerable amount of trade, okay, with Mesopotamia. Bahrain was probably the port which was the point of exchange for this trade between the Indus Valley and the cities of Mesopotamia. All right. Now, there are some other interesting questions that we might want to think about. All right. I mentioned to you before that there's a body of water very often close by, a river. Right. Most of these cities have developed along the sides of a river, which meant that probably they had some source of fish. The rivers were also used for transportation, right? And if you're wondering what were some of the kinds of items that were exported to Mesopotamia, ivory, peacocks, okay? And there have been Indus Valley seals that have been found, all right, in Mesopotamia. Quite a substantial number of these seals have been found in Mesopotamia, which seems to be, again, clear evidence of the fact that there was, in fact, this kind of trade that went on between the two. The alluvial soil that you have there is fertile if watered, and the irrigation came not from canal irrigation. There just isn't enough evidence to suggest that there was canal irrigation. But if you had, obviously, a river, the city was on the banks of a river, you are growing crops, you need water, well, you can obviously draw water from the river, right? I mean, so there's obviously some source of being able to irrigate the land, relying upon also natural rainfall. But you wouldn't have had much natural rainfall because this area, as I said, is quite dry, quite arid. All right? Right? So these are some of the key features. Now, as I said, there are a few interesting questions. Was there some kind of class division of labor? Right? One way between the people over there. You know, if you have a city, the likelihood is you're going to have some kind of hierarchies. All right? I mean, this is what it means in part when you have cities, when you have urban culture, is that you establish hierarchies within a population, right? And these granaries here, as I said, suggest that there's some kind of hierarchy. If you have very large granaries, it also suggests some machinery of state power, some machinery of state power. Now, we don't know to what extent they had this kind of machinery, but they would have had to have some machinery. And you would have had to have some kind of machinery of state power in order to obviously build a planned city, which these were, right? Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Lothal, these are planned cities, so there has to be some, if somebody is doing the town planning, you need the equivalent of a modern day committee that's sitting down there and deciding how you're going to have the layout of this particular city. And this is what I mean when I talk about the machinery of state power. And when you do have the machinery of state power, that itself introduces some political distinctions. All right. Religion, as I've said, can't really say much. Right? And I've already read that quotation to you from Bhasham, trying to indicate that why we might be a little bit, agnostic about this question. I don't want to incidentally endorse necessarily Jawaharlal Nehru's view, which I mentioned to you, where he says that this is an evidence of a secular civilization, because I think that errs on the opposite side. That is that in the 1930s, 1940s, there was pressure, political pressure, to try to produce an argument saying that, well, essentially the nature of Indian civilization is completely secular. Well, the idea of being secular is a relatively modern concept. Right? How does one transplant it back to something like 2000 BCE? Right? So this is why I think the preferred position, the position that I have, is that I think one has to be largely agnostic on this particular matter. I could add a great deal more, but we don't really have time to get into all the details. For example, did these people have boats? Well, yes, there is evidence. Right? There's evidence of the fact that they had factories or shops, okay, which produce beads, because they found lots of beads. Right? Now, if they produce beads, they produce jewelry. If they produce jewelry, then the likelihood is that, again, there were some people who had the leisure to and the means to buy jewelry. Okay? And this is how you would make inferences about whether there was, in fact, some kind of stratification in this society. Right? But this is what we're dealing is. What we're dealing with is largely archaeological evidence. We're dealing with artifacts found at these sites, and then you try to put together a little story. Now, sometime around, as I said, 1750, 1800, right, this civilization is going to begin to disappear. The decay is setting in earlier. Some scholars have divided the Harappan civilization into three phases, the early phase, the middle phase, the late phase. In fact, I used to do that myself. I'm not quite sure that that's very productive now, because again, we keep on uncovering evidence which upsets some of these traditional distinctions. Okay, what is clear is that sometime around 1800, perhaps a century or two before that, signs of decay began to set in, right? And around 1800, 1750, 1800, this civilization is going to more or less disappear. Now, the reasons have already been mentioned to you. One of the reasons for that, and this is what leads us into the next segment, all right, the next major segment, and according to the Hindu nationalists, this is where Indian history really begins, frankly, okay, from their point of view, is the coming of the Aryans. That this civilization may in fact have been overrun by the Aryans. I want to tell you a little bit about the Aryans and some of the controversies. Let me push this screen up first. Because some of the things that I'm going to mention to you will not be transparent unless we look at some related points. All right. Now, we are talking essentially about three groups of people that we need to be thinking about together. Okay. So we've got the Aryans, and then we've got the Harappans. And remember what I said to you, that Harappans here means basically, right, the people who lived in Lothal, Mohenjo-daro, all of that, a spread of about 1,000 miles north to south, from the northeast to the southwest, going along the rivers. Okay? And then we're talking about a group of people called the Dravidians. Okay? Now, where did the Aryans come from? Well, they come from west of India. They come from perhaps what is today present-day Georgia, somewhere around the Ural Mountains, okay, and what used to be the former Soviet Union, right? Okay? They're coming from much further west. They're coming into India. There used to be what is called Aryan invasions. And the word invasion is an ugly word in the English language. Nobody wants to use it, frankly. Even the invaders don't want to use it because it casts them in a bad light, and obviously those who have been invaded certainly are not happy about it, right? So most people don't really speak about the Aryan invasion. It used to be quite common to speak several decades ago about the Aryan invasions of India. Now we use a gentler word, migrations, okay? The Aryan migrations into India, taking place over a long period of time. Because who are these people? I mean, they're basically pastoralists, all right? And one of the things they're going to bring with them is the horse. You do not see the horse on any Indus Valley seal at all. right? And there's no osteo evidence, no bones of horses to be found that can be dated to before 2000 BCE. So some of the dating that they've done suggests that the horse first came to India around 2000 BCE, which more or less coincides with the beginning of the decay of this civilization. Remember, I said that by 1800 it disappears, but perhaps a century or two before that it begins to decay. So the Aryans are beginning to come. There is, by the way, a group of people, okay, who are firmly of the view that the Aryans never came to India, because their claim is that India is the original homeland of the Aryans. Okay? India is the original homeland of the Aryans. These are what we call Hindu nationalist historians. Many of them are not historians. They're actually supported by people living in Silicon Valley, working away on the internet and filling up the internet with claims, thousands of such claims. Okay? But the scholarly evidence, by and large, is still solidly on this side of the story, namely that, yes, the Aryans came into India, okay, and they started coming sometime around roughly 2000 BCE, right? And these migrations continued over a period of time. Why should people want to make the other claim? Partly because then you want to show that India is in fact the homeland of the great Aryan civilization, and from India they dispersed to other parts of the world, such as Iran, okay, or into portions of Europe, right? So Hitler's ideologues would have to rethink the whole question of who were the Aryans, where they came from, so forth and so on, if we went with this view. Okay, but as I said, the scholarly consensus is quite clear that the Aryans are coming into India, and they're coming from further west, right? So this is again, my notorious map here, okay, and they're coming from much further west into India. All right, now as they came, they probably pushed the people who were living there further south. Okay, and this is where we now get into the third term, the Dravidians. There is a group of people here in the northwest, okay, now not in India, now in Pakistan, a group of people speaking a language called Brahui. Now this is not an Indo-Aryan language. It's an island of people speaking a religion which has very close affinities with the languages spoken in South India, over here. Okay, very close affinity, linguistic affinity. So the supposition is that when the Aryans started coming, that they pushed these people who were living here, let's call them the Harappan people, okay, but maybe the Harappan people are the same as today's Dravidians, right? I'm not saying I'm entirely certain about that, or that anybody else is entirely certain about it, but that's one conjecture, right? And they were pushed, and why should we say that they might have been Dravidians? Because this language, Brahui, is related, linguistically speaking, to languages spoken in South India, not to the languages spoken over there. So in other words, when the Aryans came, a pocket of these people got left behind. They got left untouched, which is quite possible. I mean, in the Himalayan range, there would be lots of little villages here and there, and many of them might have been left unscathed, right? Okay, so that's one theory which suggests that the present-day Dravidians, right, were the people living in South India, the speakers of Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, and so on, that these people might have been the same as the Harappans, or that in any case they are the descendants of the people who were the Harappans. Okay, now so the Aryans start coming in, and there's one interesting little thing we have to contend with right away, that there's absolutely no archaeological evidence for the study of the Aryans, none whatsoever, absolutely zero, frankly. There's no archaeological deposit. This was not, the Aryans did not produce an urban civilization, so you actually went from an urban civilization to something that was more, the Marxist historians would have called it more barbarous, because it was not urban, goes back to the prehistoric, age, right? So so in other words, it's not like you're going from rural civilization to what eventually becomes an urban civilization, which is perhaps the trajectory that one might expect, right? In this case, it's the other way around. The Aryans come in, they're basically pastoralists, and they don't really produce a settled civilization, which is one reason why you don't have archaeological evidence. I mean, you have to have lived in a place for a period of time, and then you can, as I said, there are going to be layers and layers that you're going to be able to excavate. These people didn't really do that, right? So we have this strange contrast that for the Harappans, we have significant archaeological evidence, but we don't have any texts, right? We have a language which we can't decipher. In the case of the Aryans, what you're going to have is a huge corpus of texts, right? Originally not written down, originally passed down in the oral tradition. Something we'll think about later on. Originally passed down in the oral tradition, right? But you can now look at the language used in these texts and make inferences as to when this language was first used. How far back does it go? You know, for example, UCLA has a scholar, you know, who's a scholar of Vedic Sanskrit, right? So she specializes in the Sanskrit that is to be encountered in the earliest Vedas, which are the texts that are going to be produced by the Aryans, right? More about that later. Here we're just trying to first understand some of the major distinctions, okay? So the Aryans come into India, and their migration starts somewhere around 2000 BC. So you're going to get the beginning of the early Vedic period, and then you have something called the later Vedic period, you know. So the early Vedic period, you could say, is, you know, roughly around 1800 BCE to, you know, something like, let's say, about 1000. Okay, and then the later Vedic period is about 1000 BCE to about 600 BCE, right, roughly. Okay, now the Aryans bring the horse, and since they bring the horse, it means that at least they have superior military technology in comparison to the Harappans. Because if you have a horse, you can tether the horses, and then you can have a chariot, right? And the Harappans didn't have that. The toy cart is not a chariot. It's just a toy cart. Let's not mistake it for a chariot. Okay, it's a little toy. Now we're talking about a chariot, and we're talking about people on horses, and we know that cavalry has an advantage over infantry in modern military terms. Okay, but both are obsolete now, of course, with the drones and all of that, right? But that's what we're speaking about. Okay, so they come, and in fact the Rig Veda, which is the major of the Vedas, and there are some extraordinarily anomalous things that we're going to try to understand about the Rig Veda. It's a compilation of 1028 hymns or songs, 1028. There are 4 Vedas. The Rig Veda I want to spend a few moments on. You can read about the rest of the Vedas in the little book that you have by myself, you know. Okay, just an enumeration. The first thing that is anomalous about it is that, let's say, if you were speaking to a modern day Hindu and say, what is the foundation of Hinduism? And somebody might say, the Rig Veda. Okay? So, for example, in the 19th century, there's a man who's going to come along. His name is Dayanand Saraswati. This is what I meant when I said that sometimes I'm going to move away from the chronology for a minute, just so that you understand some of the politics of what it means to do this kind of history. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Dayanand Saraswati comes along. He's an Indian who's going to argue that the true foundation of Indian culture is what the Aryans brought with them and the Vedas. So he says we have to return to the teachings of the Vedas. Okay? And these Vedas, the teachings of the Vedas, have been corrupted over a period of time. All right? So now, think of it this way. If you're a Muslim, we know that the key work, okay, the one authoritative work is something called the Koran. And you're supposed to know the Koran if you're a Muslim. Well, among Hindus, it doesn't work that way. In fact, hardly any Hindu knows the Rig Veda. And in fact, it's very interesting that there is a press in India called the Gita Press. So the Gita Press publishes huge amounts of Hindu literature, right? So they publish various editions of the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita. One work that they do not publish is the Veda. Simply will not publish it. Because the Rig Veda, they say, is apurusha, which means it's not made by hand of man. And what is not made by the hand of man cannot be replicated by the hand of man. You're not supposed to really read the Veda, and I don't know any Hindu, frankly, practicing Hindu, who actually knows the Rig Veda. Okay? So this is very unlike, let's say, a Muslim or a Christian, a devout Christian, who would know the New Testament, maybe even the Old Testament, right? But certainly the New Testament, and certainly portions of the New Testament, maybe, you know, the Synoptic Gospels, for example. Okay? Well, that's not the case with the Rig Veda. This is one of the things that is highly anomalous. Okay? The Veda is not made by the hand of man and is not meant to be read by people. It's not meant to be reproduced, really, for the most part. And you don't have to be a Hindu to know the Veda, not even remotely. Not even remotely. Okay? So I'm going to stop here because we're running out of time. I'll continue with my discussion of the Aryans and move into a discussion of the Upanishads and related material. Okay? And a reminder to you, no class on Monday because it's a holiday, so our next meeting is on Wednesday.